Thank you for being here today, spending your Saturday afternoon here with us to discuss the pressing issue of unity and diversity. As we all know, Malaysia is a very complex country. There's a multitude of races, ethnicities, languages, and religion. And even after 55 years of independence, there is very little progress made in terms of fostering a common vision. Right? There's still debates on what system of education Malaysians should be a part of. There's still debates on who should own the wealth in the country. Many unresolved issues surrounding whether or not a non-Malay, non-Muslim can be a leader for all. Right? So these lingering, enduring, unresolved issues continue to haunt us even after decades of supposedly independence. It is to make sense of this dilemma, to make sense of where we are now as Malaysians, that this forum was organized by the Islamic Renaissance Front Project Dialogue and Liberty Center. With us today are three esteemed panelists, people who believe have valuable perspectives to share on this issue based on their long track record of service, politics and activism in Malaysia. Let me just introduce our panelists one by one. Sat in the middle of the table is Saudara Anil Neto, Treasurer for Aliran, well-known blogger, writer and political commentator. Please give him a round of applause. To my right-hand side of the table is Fadia Nadwa Fikri, a well-known activist with Lawyers for Liberty and member of the Secretariat for an organization I'm sure you've all heard of, especially recently, Swaram. She has an established track record of activism. She's represented Adam Adli, a well-known student youth activist. She was also recently in France to testify for the Scorpion case. She's helped with the Bukit Jalil evicted residents and so on and so forth. A list of commitment and dedication to causes is very, very long indeed. And we're happy to have her here to share the insights on the issue. To my left-hand side of the far left-hand side of the table is Stephen Sim, Senior Executive Officer of Penang Institute, City Councillor for Seberang Pride, and most recently an author with a book entitled The Audacity to Think, an invitation to rethink politics. Do you bring any copies? Only one copy. You can have a preview of the copy. And if you like, you can discuss further on where you can purchase it. But he brings with us a dual pronged perspective, right? As someone who's academically inclined, but someone who's also in policy, he can give us a more rounded perspective on the issue. So altogether, we can expect a very dynamic and rich exchange of ideas. So without further ado, we shall begin our discussion. Our first panelist, Saudara Anil Neto. Let's welcome him to the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming, and thanks to Quad and Project Dialogue for organizing this event. It comes at a very important time, just before, a few months before our general election, and people's focus is going to be on what's going to happen in the general election. But behind the campaigning and all that is this thing bubbling behind the surface. Who exactly are we, and what are we all about? Before this forum, I was talking to Fadia, and she said she comes from Kedah. We're discussing the rich history of Kedah, which predates Malacca. And unfortunately, most of us don't know much about the history of Kedah. because for us, in our history books, it all began with Malacca. I was doing a bit of research into the history of Kedah, and I found that actually there was a whole old globalization happening in this region even before Malacca, the history of Malacca as we know it. And we have this actually a rich cultural heritage, very cosmopolitan. Even if you look at Penang, it's very cosmopolitan. The first church in Penang was actually a Portuguese church, and they spoke Malay. Can you imagine that a Portuguese church in Penang speaking, the language used was Malay, local language. So somewhere along the way, we've sort of like compartmentalized ourselves into three major ethnic groups: Malays, Chinese, Indians. And unfortunately, the dialogue seems to exclude a lot of other groups. Can we have the next slide? So I think the first thing in any discussion of unity is to remember the forgotten groups in our national discourse. Or when we talk about politics, whether education, healthcare, and all the rest of it, we seem to forget that all these other groups exist, and they are somehow marginalized. And you have different barriers created, not only racial. When you talk about unity, our first thing when you think is racial barriers, but there are also other barriers which we construct in our society, which are no less important or perhaps even more important than race, as we will discuss further down. So we have the Orang Asli and indigenous groups often excluded from our discourse, and these groups have among the highest poverty rates in the country. The Orang Asli, as we all know, and the Bumiputra, Sabah and Sarawak, their poverty rate is even higher than the other major ethnic groups. And Sabah itself has one of the highest poverty rates. Not to mention places like Kelantan, Terengganu, rural parts of Kelantan, Terengganu and Sarawak. So poverty is one big barrier. And right now, talking about forgotten groups, the Penang are blockading the construction of the Murum Dam in Sarawak. And I was just reading one of the leaked reports in Sarawak report, and they said about, the vast majority of them do not even have identity cards. So this puts them at a tremendous disadvantage. So what unity are we talking about when the people who are indigenous in the land don't even have the basic status to be identified as citizens, our identity cards. So that's our own indigenous peoples. Then migrants, refugees and asylum seekers. Again, we are discussing, and we probably have over 2 million legal migrant workers in the country, but then there are another probably 1 million or 2 other undocumented migrant workers. So if you look at the Malaysian population, 28 million, maybe 29 by now, 4 million, let's say 4 million migrant workers, that would make it 15 or to 20% of the population, perhaps 20% even, who knows. But 20%, that means 1 in 5. And Fadi was saying 2 out of 3 of Malaysian workers are actually migrant workers. 2 out of 3 workers, can you imagine that, are actually migrant workers. But in our reporting, in our newspapers and all that, the discussion never or rarely gives them a voice. If at all we hear about migrant workers, it's usually associated with something negative. And migrant workers are seen as, well, we want their neighbor, but we don't want to recognize them or give them a voice. So they are somehow hidden away in society, in cramped housing. So they're usually crowded in houses which employers squeeze as many of them as possible into one house. Then we have other afflicted groups. Apart from the Penang, we have people living in liners and Pengarang who are being evicted from their homes. These are development-induced displaced persons, a term is sometimes used, development-induced displaced persons. Increasingly, we're finding that people are being thrown out of their lands because companies are eyeing the land which they are living on for various reasons, whether property development, mining, or basically any other reason they can think of, plantations. Even like Penang is a refinery which is displacing people. So that is another case of groups that are forgotten or displaced by our model of development. Then you have people of different orientations, too many to list, but the common ones I'm sure you all are aware. And people who are displaced, disabled and suffering from all kinds of illness. Our planning does not include these groups. Even when you go to the elections, we don't seem to cater for disabled voters to come and vote. Sometimes people have to carry them in and actually go and vote. Or if the polling groups might be on the first floor, people have to climb up staircases just to go and vote. So if that's your voting process, can you imagine the other day-to-day planning issues which fail to take into account the displaced persons? And finally, the other people who are hidden from our sight are the plantation workers, people, migrant workers. Also, often we don't see them in their own settlements, urban pioneers. These are all tucked away out of our sight. Next, please. We had the new economic policy in the 1970s. The objectives are noble: to eradicate poverty and to restructure society so that groups are no longer identified by race. But along the way, these noble objectives are politicized and people were divided by race. And this so happened to fit into the paradigm of the Barisan Nasional's race-based politics, and it's somehow used as their vote-winning propaganda tool. And unfortunately, today we still see a lot of disparities and poverty in our country after 55 years of independence. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, we do have unity, but okay, you see, all the races are represented, and there's fantastic unity at the elites, in the elite of society. These are some of the independent power producer people and other miscellaneous cronies, and it's all very united up there, and they do a lot of deals together, contracts. So there's fantastic unity there, but at the grassroots we are kept divided. Why don't we see the same level of unity at the elite stratum of society? Why don't we see that same level of unity filter down the ranks? Because it is politically useful for them to keep us divided and divide and rule, basically. So that's the type of unity we have in our country, unfortunately. And the old way of bargaining is those elites at the top get together and hobnob and come up with policies that they think that the rest of us will be happy with. But somehow it doesn't work like that anymore. The strains of society have taken its toll. Thanks. You can see this is another big problem which is overshadowing our efforts at national unity. The growing gap between the rich and the poor. So you see that the top 20% and the bottom 40%. So how can we achieve genuine unity when we have gaps like this, basic structural gaps like this in society, and they are widening? And they are not helped This doesn't just happen by chance. They're actually by economic policies that are planned. For example, we talk about introducing a goods and services tax. It's going to benefit who? Well, it's basically going to burden the majority of the population, but at the same time, they're reducing income tax and corporate tax at the highest bands. And they're giving away a 12-year tax-free status to Linus Corporation in Gebeng, Kuantan. And now, the oil and gas industry companies are getting, I don't know how many years tax-free oil and gas refineries, oil and gas trading companies, they're getting tax-free a number of years, 3 to 10 years, I think. So you see, as we introduce more and more policies like this, it benefits a certain sector of society, but that income tax, the revenue lost, will be extracted from the majority of the population. Now even your speeding tickets will be, you have traffic cameras installed all over the roads to ostensibly help in road safety, but actually a chunk of it is going to two crony companies. So they make the profits and the rest of us have to absorb the losses and subsidize them. Even your electricity, the subsidies are benefiting the independent power producers. Next. So these are some of the things, the contradictions in Malaysian society. On the one hand, we project a very moderate voice internationally, but locally it's a different case. You have groups that are emerging which are promoting a race-based agenda. And I suspect these groups are emerging to project this race-based agenda because they're trying to hold back the rest of us from bridging ethnic barriers or bridging ethnic and other cultural barriers. And we have seen that Malaysians can come together on common purposes for various issues. More on this, this next. So basically, we want to talk about bridging gaps. I think it's important to build on dialogue, and they're generally recognized as 4 different types of dialogue. The dialogue of everyday life, helping and responding to those in need. And we saw this, especially in the aftermath of the tsunami. In Penang, for example, the worst hit tsunami village was the Kampung Nelayan in Tanjung Uma, near the floating mosque area. And the first group which managed to reach that kampung, predominantly Chinese Muslims descent, the first group that reached the kampung was the Buddhist Suji group. They were the first to respond, even before everybody else, the government agencies or other NGOs could act. It was the Buddhist groups which first came. So that's your dialogue of everyday life. And the dialogue of action, pursuing justice, and working on collaborative projects. I think we, coming from an NGO, I think we've had more exposure to that, so we'll look at that more depth later. And there's a third kind of dialogue, which is an inter-religious dialogue, which is we have problems getting off the ground in Malaysia. So you have to negotiate and navigate when we try and do inter-religious dialogue in Malaysia for whatever reason. It seems to become a very sensitive issue because I think perhaps it challenges the dominant discourse. And finally, there's the dialogue of spiritual experiences. If people are really committed to their various faiths, if they go deeper into their various faiths, in their various faith, they'll probably reach a spiritual core, which I think they recognize a lot of similarities among one another. So those are the different kinds of dialogue. Okay, we look at the coming together of different people or for different causes. We had 6 PSN members detained last year. There was a whole uprising of people, trying to campaign for their release, and this cut across all ethnic groups in the country. So people were coming together. And finally, I think the pressure did result in their early release. Because if you remember, the initial charges were very serious, waging war against the king and all that. No? The initial allegations and stuff. But in the end, they were released, I think after just over 30 days or so. Next. Saving the environment, people are coming together. It started off with localized groups, campaigning against power lines, against liners, against the round coal, cyanide, against the use of cyanide in gold mining and drought. Yeah, so, and all this sort of coalesced into a Himpunan Hijau, which cuts across all ethnic groups, and especially appeals to the younger people. We saw the largest environmental gathering in Malaysian history. That was the 15,000 people that gathered at Kuantan to protest against liners. And this has been repeated elsewhere in other gatherings, the latest being the Penang one. Next. Bersepri, again, that has captured the imagination of Malaysians. I remember the first birthday gathering, it was largely dominated by Malays, young Malays, Malays of all ages. But as we moved on since 2007, the first birthday gathering, the latest birthday gathering this year, it was really a multiracial, multi-religious event. And it totally caught everyone by surprise because nobody expected such a huge turnout. Even the activists, I don't think they ever expected a turnout of more than 200,000 people. Next. The campaign against the ISA, this is another successful campaign. We got rid of the ISA. Unfortunately, as Fadia told me just now, there are still 30 ISA detainees still in Kamunting. Although we are supposed to have repealed the ISA and there's a new law now, we still have 30 ISA detainees. Next. So, it's time to move beyond tolerance, mere tolerance. We have to move out and look at our real cosmopolitan heritage. Staying in Penang, living in Penang, we have that heritage in Penang, but we have to also realize that this whole region was actually a very culturally diverse region. I mean, it was like globalization within the Asian region. We've got a whole history in this Southeast Asia, people moving up and down. I was surprised myself to hear earlier this year that Rabindranath Tagore from India actually visited Penang a couple of times in 1916 and 1929 on his way to Japan. And there was already cultural engagement between Japan and India, because Japan was considered the intellectual center at the time. So it's time to move beyond tolerance. What we need is mutual respect, a real celebration, not mere acceptance, not just tolerance, not just acceptance, but a celebration of our cosmopolitan heritage, our diverse cultures, and to really include, to really push for equality in society for all people. Because we, under our constitution, I think we're supposed to be, everybody's supposed to be equal, yeah? And so, and not just be happy with our cultural heritage, but to work together collaboratively to promote greater justice and fairness in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Saudara Anyanto for giving us a very good overview of where the challenges are. On one hand, there are all these marginalized groups in Malaysia, the migrant workers, indigenous, so on and so forth, who are sidelined by the national discourse. But at the same time, you see changes on the ground through the protests that Anil showed as examples, whereby changes are happening, changes are taking place, and hopefully the changes will steer Malaysians to the right direction and ask the questions that need to be asked. Our discussions continue with Saudara Stephen Sim, who will discuss the issue in more depth with us. So let's welcome him to the floor.
I wouldn't say more depth. I've told Anil at the beginning of the forum that we are here to provide commentary to what he has just said. And I'm surprised that after listening to him, I'm actually right. We're going to provide commentary. I'm going to provide commentary to what we have just said. First of all, allow me to begin. I've seen Dr. Arifin Omar, who is a close friend of Penang Institute and a senator from Penang. But allow me to begin with two stories from the Bible. This is, after all, an interfaith forum, and I think I have to qualify myself by bringing in this religious element. But anyway, okay, the first story, these are two stories. Both stories, the first story is about the beginning of civilization. The second story is about the beginning of the church, both from the Bible. The first story is quite a famous story. It's about the Tower of Babel, found in the book of Genesis. This is the story, as I said, of how civilization began according to the Bible. A very long time ago, humanity was speaking the same language and shared the same culture. In other words, there was a lack of diversity. And then one day, somebody had a very brilliant idea. Why not build a skyscraper? That guy must be a politician or a contractor. That was the first mega project recorded in history in the Bible, of human history in the Bible. The plan was actually to build a tower so high that it reaches heaven, believed to be the dwelling place of God. The people, because of their unity, because of their similarity, one culture, one language, they become very arrogant and wanted to be like God. And God obviously didn't like the idea. So God said they are very proud, their unity made them forget who they are, their strength made them forget who they are. So the Bible said God confused the language of the people. The first skyscraper project failed because and was abandoned because people began to speak different languages. In other words, they had different opinions. In other words, diversity emerged. Okay? This is the first story about diversity. The second story, a lesser-known story, is from the New Testament in the book of Acts. This is the story about how the church was started. Slightly more than 3 months after Jesus was sentenced to death as a political rebel by the Roman Empire, the superpower of that time, the Jews in Jerusalem were celebrating what was called the Pentecost Festival. It is actually a Jewish harvest festival. Tens of thousands of Jewish pilgrims came back from all over the known world, from Europe, they had moved to Europe, from Asia, from Africa, came back to Jerusalem for pilgrimage for the Pentecost Festival. You can imagine the noisy, narrow streets of Jerusalem and filled with excited pilgrims, and all of them were speaking in different languages of their adopted homeland. In the midst of that excitement, on that day, a small group of disciples of Jesus were gathered in a small room in a house in Jerusalem. They were obviously very scared because their leaders were just sentenced 3 months ago to death by the Roman version of ISA, or rather a crime against the Yang di-Pertuan Agong of Roman Empire. So they were obviously very scared. There were so many people downstairs. They were praying, and I think prayer is often, from my observation, even in politics, prayer is often the best thing a small oppressed minority can do. I remember once in a by-election in Bukit Mertajam, I saw a group of Muslim women. They were praying along the street because the opposition or the other party, they had engaged this thuggish-looking youth in their beret, and then they were like, looking very like a bullier. But on the opposite side of the road, this group of Muslim women were praying. So this Jewish disciple of Jesus Christ, they were praying, obviously very afraid. And then suddenly, God sent His Spirit like a wind blowing into the small room and empowered the disciple. And when the Spirit of God came to them, the Bible says, the disciple was suddenly re-energized with a fresh passion to speak about the message of Jesus Christ. So they began to come down from their hiding place and went to the street and began talking about Jesus Christ and the message that He preached. But the interesting thing about this is not that they suddenly regained this bonus, but all of them were not speaking in their mother tongue. They were not speaking in Aramaic or Hebrew, the language of their people. But instead, they were speaking in foreign languages that they have never learned before. It's obviously a miracle in the Bible. So they were speaking in the languages of the Jewish pilgrims, languages of the European people, of the Asian people, of even probably Arab. But this time, you can see, there was a confusion of language, just like Babel, there was a confusion of language, but this time, although they were speaking different languages, all of them were speaking the same message of love preached by Jesus Christ. Why do I tell this story? Firstly, as I said, I need to qualify myself. This is an interfaith dialogue. I thought I should share something from the Bible, but this will be the only two stories or reference to the Bible. But secondly, and more interestingly, and perhaps even counterintuitively, I want to propose that our religious tradition have always preferred diversity, or to put it more mildly, have never see diversity as something bad. Take a look at the famous verse from the Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13, where God said, "O mankind, we have created you from a pair of men and women in the diverse nations and tribes, so that you may know each other." Is that correct? So our religious tradition, Quran and biblical, and perhaps other religious traditions which I have not explored, do not think as diversity as a bad thing. In fact, from the verses I quoted, diversity was God's creation, no less. And notice in the Quran, God did not say, "I created you so that all this diversity, so that ultimately you may have unity," but rather so that we may know from one another, to learn from one another. Hence, I want to invite us at the beginning of this discussion to rethink this whole discussion about trying to achieve unity in diversity. Religion aside, do you notice that hatred for diversity, hatred for plurality is often a very consistent trait in authoritarian society? Look at dictators from the European colonies to Hitler to Mao Zedong. All of them hated diversity. They always like to promote unity as if it is the ultimate best thing. But we are in fact a nation afraid of differences. The moment our politicians see diversity, they begin to propose solutions as if diversity is a problem. This shirt will go wrong. Okay. Okay. Go back to the next one. The other one, back. Yes. The moment our politicians see diversity, they are very quick to propose solutions as if diversity is a problem. We often hear calls for, especially in Malaysia in recent times, we often hear for calls for people to be one nation, one people, one country, one Malaysia, or even call for kerajaan perpaduan, or for the people to set aside your political and ideological differences so that we can be united or bersatu, whatever that means. As it were, to be different and to express differences cannot be tolerated in an authoritarian society. To be different is problematic for those in power, because when people are different, they are difficult to manage and control. It was Lenin himself who said that trust is good, but control is better. But when I say Lenin, don't think that diversity, hatred for diversity is a strictly communist thing. Even in a capitalist society, it is easier. The goal of capitalism is basically a single market, singularity, a common market. It is easier to produce a single product which fits everyone. So this preference for unity cuts across ideological line in authoritarian regime. In fact, I want to go a step further. How even, I wrote it in my book, how even the most progressive in us sometimes cannot bear with diversity, cannot bear with differences. So much so that we tend to see others not in the diversity of their uniqueness or their character, but rather in the pretext of respect and tolerance. I told Anil, I love it when he said we should just forget tolerance. In the pretext of respect and tolerance, we often reduce others into fellow human beings. Sounds okay, but think harder. What is a fellow human being? A fellow human being is we are trying to make others to become like us so that we can learn them more. This is as colonizing others. It is as good, if we are not careful, it is as good as creating our neighbor in the image of our own self. Okay, counterintuitive as it may sound, I want to propose that the solution, or rather to discuss how shall we move forward, the solution to the chaos of diversity is not simple unity or simple tolerance, or even more tolerance, but rather is in politics. I know all of us hate politics, but counterintuitive as it may sound, I want to propose that perhaps politics is the way forward. We must get our politics right, because ultimately, what is politics? Politics is managing diversity. I have 4 points.